Our next full-frame camera needs to be smaller, but we can't just make another RX1. It needs to be designed for vloggers. I've always wanted to understand how Sony went from this as their smallest full-frame camera to this, and all of the steps in between. But first, what's up with Sony's current product lineup? Today, Sony have created a diverse yet similarly capable consumer to professional product line. That includes the Alpha line, the ZV line, and the FX line. And the weird thing here is that each of these product lines offers essentially the same full-frame camera. In 2020, Sony announced the A7S III, and it kind of set the new standard for video specs in a hybrid camera. Using a full-frame 12-megapixel sensor, it delivered great low light performance and 10-bit recording up to 4K 120 FPS. Later, in 2021, Sony announced the FX III, which is essentially the same camera for their cinema line, minus the EVF, add some cooling, and some additional mounting options that you would find on a cinema camera. Then, another 2 years later, in 2023, they announced the ZV-E1, which again is essentially the same camera, however, doesn't have very good cooling, no EVF, no fancy mounting options, and only has one SD card slot. All of this to say, we have three near identical product offerings, each targeting slightly different market segments. But if you picked up one over the other for video, you'd be getting essentially the same result. What about a family camera? We don't have anything for families now. A camcorder with a super zoom lens, 4K 10-bit 120 FPS video, and we can sell it for $3,000. You're probably familiar with this product line from Sony. This is the RX line, and it has three different variants: the compact camera RX100 line, the bridge camera RX10 line, and the fixed lens full frame RX1 line. It's been a while since we've seen a new iteration to any of these variants. So what's happened to these cameras? With the last RX100 announced in 2019, the last RX10 announced in 2017, and the last RX1 announced in 2015, it feels pretty safe to say that we're not going to see any new versions of any of these products. The RX100 had a heavily rumoured 8th iteration, rumoured for the end of 2024, but it's currently about to turn February 2025 and we haven't seen anything yet. But why has this happened? Well, the ZV line. Remember the ZV-E1, the full frame, essentially A7S III or FX III? Well, there's a whole product line there, including the ZV-1, which has had multiple iterations, that essentially removes the RX100 from even needing to exist. Then there's the ZV-E10, which essentially is a crop sensor version of the ZV-E1, and then the ZV-E1 itself. They are managing to find ways to replace the RX line across the board. But the RX1 does not have a replacement in the ZV line. Instead, it's been replaced elsewhere. Compared to the compact RX100 line or the bridge RX10 line, the RX1 feels like the unique standout product in Sony's full-frame camera offerings. In the chaos of Sony's many camera offerings, in the mid-range of their Alpha line has always just been the A7. It's had 4 iterations so far, and since the 3rd iteration, we had the A7C. That was kind of the compact, slightly updated sidekick to the A7 III. Likewise, the A7C Mark II is the compact, lightly updated sidekick to the A7 IV. I've personally owned the A7C, the A7C II, and the RX1. And I think the A7C must be Sony's logical replacement to the RX1. And as little as I want to agree with them, I can sort of understand why. We must always remember that a flippy screen makes everything better. Just make sure you keep the LCD at low resolution and make the EVF low resolution, or take it away entirely. What does the A7C II have that the RX1 had? This list is quite short, but we're going to start from the outside of the camera. Both have a scroll wheel for the menu and ISO, a rear thumb dial, and an exposure compensation dial. That's kind of where the similarities end. The A7C II has an EVF and no pop-up flash, while the RX1 has a pop-up flash but no EVF. So what about the internal specs of these cameras? The RX1 has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, whereas the A7C II has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor. The RX1 sensor is not stabilized, and there's no optical stabilization in the fixed 35mm f2 Zeiss lens. Whereas on the A7C II, we do have sensor shift image stabilization and active stabilization, which adds digital stabilization with a small crop. And of course, the A7C II can take any other stabilized lenses from Sony as well. With all this buzz around the Fuji X100 and the Ricoh GR lines, imagine if we had an RX2, an RX1 Mark II, or an RX1R Mark III. Well, if we do, there's definitely not going to be an EVF. I don't even care about leaf shutter anymore. All it needs is a flippy screen and electronic IBIS. Have a quick listen to this. That's the leaf shutter of the RX1. Now listen to this. That's the mechanical curtain shutter of the A7C II. Now, the leaf shutter is the unique advantage of the RX1 in Sony's full-frame camera lineup. And this has the benefits of a mechanical shutter over an electronic shutter, which can introduce rolling shutter that makes our images look like jelly. But one day, maybe, the global shutter that was announced and shown in the A9 III might trickle down through the A7 V, maybe into the A7C Mark III. But until then, the leaf shutter is definitely an advantage over the A7C II. The RX1 is really a compact camera first with amazing full-frame functionality, whereas the A7C II is a solid hybrid camera that happens to be smaller than most. So while they have some similarities, I feel like choosing one over the other is kind of impossible. Unless you already have another dedicated hybrid camera, the RX1 can't be a do-it-everything, whereas the A7C II can definitely do it all. Let's say we pair the A7C II with a comparable lens to the RX1's fixed 35mm f2, as I have with this Samyang 35mm 1.8 lens. Which camera is going to be more flexible in this setup? Well, the RX1 just has a 35mm at 24 megapixels, whereas the A7C II can actually crop in on this 35 to give us a 52mm at 14 megapixels, which might not sound like a lot, but in some situations this can work out great if you want an extra focal length and you don't mind a slight dip in resolution. Sadly, the RX1 did not have this feature, and neither did the later iteration, the RX1R Mark II. But if they ever made a new one, that would be a great addition. You know what else would make a great addition? Using my presets on your RAW files. You can pick up my Kodak film stock presets, my Fujifilm film stock presets, and my naturally filmic presets, all together in a 3-pack bundle, and then viewers of this video can save an extra 20% using this code at checkout. I stand by these as some of the best film simulation presets you can buy, and they're the presets I use on 100% of the images you see me share online, including on Instagram, where I'm posting every single day this year. The RX1 is best suited to one genre of photography, and that is street photography, which is what I've been using it for the last 6 months or so. The A7C Mark II is much more of an all-rounder as a hybrid camera, but it still is pretty good as a full-frame street photography camera. So how do the two smallest full-frame cameras from Sony compare specifically for street photography? If I had to choose an everyday photography camera and I didn't mind a few quirks, the RX1 would definitely be up there with my number one choice. However, if I needed something that can do a bit of everything and had reliable autofocus, of course the A7C II is going to win. But the A7C II isn't that specialist camera. The RX1 really is. For everyday street photography, in the last year, it's delivered some of my favourite images, and I think the image quality still stands up today, and this camera can still be bought for pretty cheap considering everything you're getting. But of course, if you're looking for the newer iterations, it's going to cost you over 3 times as much for essentially the same camera. If we want to stay ahead of the curve, we need to understand why everyone wants a fixed lens camera again. I guess I should just watch this video and find out as much as I can.